Okay, who's ready to do that? Are you ready? Yeah. Anyone not ready? It's okay if you're not ready, but maybe you're the wise people that they mentioned, the wisdom. So that's the situation we're in. That's the moment of time in which we find ourselves. And it's a huge responsibility for our generation of teachers in higher education. So what I'm going to do is try and show you some ways that you can actually engage with this. So beyond the scary bits and into what you can actually do. So you ready for that? Yeah? Now, I am going to ask you some questions at the end, and they will be, what are you actually going to do from what I've shown you? So get ready. You don't have to write anything down. I'll give you all these slides. You can engage with all of this. You can watch the video and show your colleagues the video. But I'm going to ask you for each of you to go away with one action from today that you're going to do after today. So it's Carpe Diem, seize the day. So just to say where I think we are in the moment of time, I mean, this is an extraordinary moment in human history, and that's what makes us more responsible for how we actually manage it. I do believe the future doesn't just happen. We can steer it in the way that we choose to create it, and particularly through education and higher education. So it's most important not to be someone who stands by and says, oh, well, I'm waiting to see what others are going to do, but actually to try and shape and steer your own futures and that of your students in the way that you would choose to be. And this is one way of framing it, that actually the time span is compressing, the first line. The kind of talent that human needs is changing in order to make the most of the era we're in history, and the kind of tools that we need and the skills that we need, and they are changing too. Now, every one of us here has actually grown up in the industrial and the information age, but actually we're preparing our students for the future of something very different. So that's my main thesis, that we actually have to disrupt ourselves a bit in order to be able to give our students the best for the future. And what's more, the velocity of change is, it requires a quite quick adaptation. We do actually need to look at things differently. 2 years ago, I was still in Australia then, working in Australia. My second youngest child, she had her second baby, and she wanted her mother, that was me luckily, to be there. The baby is called Jazz. She's called her Jazz. When Jazz was born, the midwife immediately put her into my arms, and I held her like this. And I'd just been reading in a Time magazine how newborn babies in the current era, at least half of them will live to be 120 years old. And I thought, oh my goodness, how are we going to educate you for the future? How are we going to prepare you for 120 years of unpredictable change and challenge in the world, and also to make your contribution rather than to take from it? Well, Jazz is 2 years old now, and she's grown up completely in the augmented era. She's already able to Skype me by switching on her daddy's iPad and switching me off when she's had enough to talking to me as well. So what we need to look at is this new agility. The old paradigm was very much expertise, and that's very challenging to all of us who are working in this kind of environment, because frankly, we are used to being the experts, aren't we? We are used to having just that little bit more knowledge and a little bit more scientific and appropriate knowledge than everyone else. And so it's really quite hard to change that paradigm and to move to a new focus where the adaptability mindset and the agility to engage with others and remain engaged over long periods of time as things changed around us. So that's my kind of thesis today, that all of us have this responsibility to generate that in others, and this sort of longevity of learning throughout our lives. And also the new reality at work. I also have a project which is called Jobs of the Future, which is engaging with both universities and employers, especially the more forward-looking employers, who are then actually changing what happens at work. So they're actually predicting the skills that they will need graduates to have. It's really important when you're listening to an old-style talk like this that you do answer your phone as well. So it's really important that you can multitask. So if that's your babysitter, I think you should talk to her. So, so the old economy is gradually changing and the new economy is actually coming along. And this is the new reality. It's not some sort of scientific vision. It's actually happening, and you can shape it in the ways that you actually want. So this is my simple summary of that in the past, in order to survive as a human, you would need to do everything yourself. And then we learnt to barter and to trade. And then there was this super hyper focus on marketable skills. But we're now learning that the most important skill is to learn to adapt and change and create new value for our organisations, and new value to solve the enormous problems of the world that we're preparing people to tackle. So do you get where I'm at from this? Yeah? Is it scary? No. So probably what's most important, really, is each of this. Let's kind of try and sniff out what we can actually do with this. So I'm going to introduce you to this concept, Education 1.0 to 3.0. Have you heard it before? Yeah? Some have? Yeah? It's been used mainly in the computer and IT fields, but here I'm using it more for educational purposes. And when you see this little sparkly light bulb, that's your opportunity to note down what you're going to do. All right, so there might be some ideas from here. So look out for the light bulb moment as we go through. So have you seen this picture before? No? Yes. Yes, it's done the rounds of quite a few talks, but for me, I really, really like it. It's actually portraying a lecture at the University of Bologna, which was the very first modern university in Europe prior to Oxford and Cambridge. And it was done actually in the 14th century. But does this look a little bit like what we're doing now? And what a lot of us do on a daily basis in our institutions. So obviously, lecture from to read. So the lecturer was reading. I promise I've got no notes, so I'm making this up as I go along, but he would have been reading something. And then you can see the first row. People are quite attentive, aren't they? And I can see your president and all the important people in the first row who are really looking up at me like this. And then the next row, well, a little bit less attentive, don't you think? The next row down, there's one written like this, is sort of eyeing up the student next to him. in that way. And a bit further back, well, the one that's obviously is asleep here. Any students sleep in your lectures? Oof. Thank you for admitting that. They do in everyone's. So that's the sleeper. There's one at the back making a date look with the one. There's quite a lot actually thinking about what they're going to have for dinner, I think. So, and really, this has been a very efficient and effective way of conveying information throughout the last 1,000 years of universities. And so, that's the way we were taught as well, wasn't it, all the way through? And so it feels normal and natural to us, but I'm afraid you're seeing the very end of this. People will laugh at this in the future. And, you know, so you can see it's 1,000 years of this. So if it feels hard to change, it is hard to change. You know, it's completely embedded in all our cultures, especially in Europe. But also, if you ever get a chance to go to Nalanda in India, now they're building it up as a new peace university. It's a great place because you can walk around the ruins, 6th to the 5th century BC. And if you walk around there, it feels quite normal. You know, there's a lecture theatre, there's a library. I suppose it was scrolls in that day, but or tablets. There's a refectory, there's archways that they used to walk to. There's a place, you know, for personal study. It's really very, very similar to the buildings that we build around. So there's all of that going on. Whereas actually, these are the kind of things, really, that happen now. So although we can still use our physical spaces, we tend to blog about it. We have virtual patients. There's the maker space, you know, down here. And those kind of things. We're using our physical spaces very differently now from the way it was before. So how to understand this and how to move us forward, how to actually give us a map for the future, a pathway to follow. So I'm going to show you 2 ways of looking about this, and don't forget about your light bulb moments. So one way of looking at it is to divide up everything that happens in post-compulsory education into different components, because it's really quite overwhelming when you try and change everything and transform everything at once. So instead, what we've done is divide it up into different components that you might be able to get a grip with and make a difference. And then if we all do it, it will multiply over time. So we've divided it up into these: learners, the nature of knowledge, the process of learning, technology, of course the technology is there, the role of teaching and teachers, what I've called graduateness, in other words, what we're preparing people to do when they leave us and go on to other things, and the actual location for learning. And what we do generally is look at the last 1,000 years of this, and you'll see there's particular characteristics of each one of these. The students in the past were typically a kind of an apprentice or almost an acolyte sitting at the face of the expert professor. Do yours do that? Mine don't do it anymore. And knowledge was therefore transmitted. In other words, I would unzip my head, take out what was in it, unzip helmets, chuck it over to him some way, zip it up, and then I might test him to make sure that he received it okay. Yeah? Is that how it was done? And so learning was received by that individual. And the technology we used was pretty fixed. It was all the things that were around us. And once you actually have fixed technology, it does structure human behaviour. It's a characteristic of affordance, that once things are a particular way, we assume that we should behave in a particular way around it. And then teaching was obviously teacher to student, because we knew more than they did and they wanted to learn from us. And we were the experts. And the graduateness was, we got a degree. It didn't necessarily prepare us for the future, but it meant we knew things that other people didn't know in our topic area. And we've already shown you some of the static and highly sustainable and highly efficient learning locations. So is that clear about Education 1.0? Does it make sense to you? So, around 50 years or so now, maybe a bit longer, some of these have started to change. And I think there's two main drivers for that. One of them has been what's known, I don't know the German word for it, but massification, the huge volume of students both eligible to and capable of benefiting from a higher education. The school leaving age has gradually increased, and when I left school in the UK, I won't tell you the date, I came from a working class family, an underclass family really, and it was only because I went to a selective school that I stayed till I was 16. The school leaving age was still 15, and there was absolutely no question of my going to university, absolutely zero. You know, so it just wasn't. I had to go to work and earn money for the family. And I was lucky that I stayed an extra year and took some public exams. And around that time in the UK, I don't know the stats for Austria, but you will, there was about 4% went to university. And those of us who were going to be teachers, it wasn't degree qualified at that time. Whereas in the UK now, it's around 50%, about 50%. And that's in about 50 years that has happened. So obviously that's going to massively change the system that we're in. So when you start to look at that, students are becoming a bit different, slightly different people. They don't sit there with their mouths open like baby birds waiting for us to push things in. And of course, around 20 or so years ago, the advent of technology came along, which also changed an awful lot of things. So knowledge, there was a recognition that it was kind of socially constructed and applied. Although we know there is empirical knowledge and we're worried about all the fake news around, nevertheless, people are getting information which they call knowledge from a whole wide variety of sources. And learning, therefore, is formal and informal. It doesn't only happen when they're sitting in front of the lecturer on the lecture and listening. It happens all day, every day, with others in all sorts of other ways. I think this is probably why my work has always been very popular, for example, in Scandinavia, which has got much more of a dialogue and a socially constructed position on knowledge. And so people cautiously started to apply technology to more formal education and started to learn. And when I started, the 5-stage model, which some of you know, I did the original research on that more than 25 years ago now. And that was with the very early days of bulletin boards and discussion boards. And it was a grounded model. In other words, I observed what people did when they were given the opportunity to learn through technology mediation. It wasn't a model that was out there that I then applied, because it wasn't out there. It didn't exist before. And also partly because of volume, and partly because the change towards the understanding of knowledge, teaching became sort of peer encouraged as well. And it meant that because of the volume, that we couldn't be the only person doing the teaching. And this is where the role of e-moderator came in. This was the role of teaching assistants in schools. and monitors and peer review and all those kind of things came into being, and they're all really quite recent. And then when people graduated, it was seen as kind of a license to practice as a doctor, as a lawyer, as an engineer, as a teacher. And so that meant that some of the learning had to be applied. It wasn't just empirical knowledge. It was about actually what you were going to do with it and how you were going to use it. And that started to roll back into the modes of learning. Does that make sense to you? Yeah. And of course, the term blended learning and flexible learning and active learning and 101 other types of descriptive words about learning came in. And so it showed that we were starting to understand learning differently. We still don't really understand learning. We know more about what happens on Mars, actually, than what happens in our heads. But we still started to label and aspire to different ways of doing things. I'm sure every one of you has done that. So can you see that we've moved a bit? Yeah? I'm sure Education 2.0 is more or less the way you're teaching here, would you say? Yeah? No? Was that a no? There's a few... So actually, because it takes us so long to change our educational institutions, because it takes us, because of our traditions, because of our values, because of our missions, because of the way we ourselves learn, we change things very slowly. So what we need to do is to look ahead and try and create the future by looking at what might be next. So I'm going to have a go at Education 3.0 now, and this is where your light bulb moment should come in. So learners, the actual students themselves, they're really almost becoming everyday researchers. No longer do you have to get to do your PhD or your master's thesis to do research. They're almost researching daily. And the most important thing we can teach them is to understand what is valid, worthwhile knowledge. In a world of fake news, that's critically important. How to interpret it, how to imply it, which will stand them in good stead throughout the rest of their lives. But it's quite challenging for us, isn't it, to think of our students in that way as co-developers, co-researchers. And knowledge itself is everywhere. There's certainly one of the things that was said to me at the University of Liverpool, which has got a very strong tradition. It was the first red brick university. That's where that term came from. And the chief librarian said to me the other day, she said, "You've got more knowledge on your Apple Watch on your wrist than we have in the whole of this library and the tradition of Victorians." So you have to think about knowledge quite differently and the way we use it. I've already spoke to you about my granddaughter Jazz. We have to have this lifelong, multi-dimensional approach. She will no longer just be a lawyer or just be a doctor. She will need to add value both to herself, to her community, and to the scientific community in the world in lots of different ways throughout her life. And of course, we need to take a digital-first approach. You know, we have to think digital first. I think if you get this light bulb moment, you think, well, how can digital support me and enable this approach better? Then you end up in a very different place of thinking of it as an add-on. And mobility is everything, and mobility is so good for learning. It makes learning authentic, it makes it contextualized, it makes it accessible. All the things we say we want to do for our students, think mobile and you'll start to see a whole range of new products. And I tell you importantly, what you need to do, if you want to change your teaching ready to create Education 3.0, you need to design for learning, rather than to go back to doing the way you were taught or the way you were taught to teach. The way you were taught to teach, or the way you yourself learned, which almost certainly occupies the biggest space in your brain about being a good teacher. You have to chuck it out and become a designer. So think what you know about design, that's really important. You need to work out what the purpose of what you're doing is, create a pathway towards it, and you need to do it with others. You can't do it on your own. It's no longer a single occupation. So I've got a whole range of things I do on learning design now. I'll briefly mention them later, but I've got a whole website about it. And when I run my courses now, I call the people learning leaders. So it's the idea of leading people towards the future. So you're no longer just moderating, although moderating is part of it. You're no longer just teaching. You're no longer just designing. You're actually a leader. You're creating the future through your leadership role. And so everything I design now, all the courses I run for other colleagues in the universities that I work in, we call them learning leaders. That's their name. And graduateness, well, as you saw in the video, we need to be prepared for very uncertain futures. So, and learning location, well, I think it needs to be enabling and chosen and everywhere. That doesn't mean to say people don't come to campus. Of course they do, if you wish them to, but they don't have to. And the way they learn needs to be chosen to create the optimum environment. And online is an environment in itself, with its own norms and values and ways of working, ways of interacting. So when you're doing your design for your teaching, you need to think of what's the very best location for this. Is it online? Is it on campus? And create a complexity that we didn't have to think about before. So any light bulb moments going on? Can you give me a wave if anyone's had any? Where do you think you are here now? Do you think you're at Education 3.0? Any votes for that? No? Any votes for 2.0? It's about half. Anyone think you're still around 1? You're moving about, yeah. I mean, what a lot of people do, if I do this as a workshop, you find the line goes like that, yeah. Okay. Right. Anyone want to create Education 3.0? Yeah? So anyone not want to? Go on, be brave. Some of it may be. Actually, it's a complex adaptive system. It's pretty difficult once you've deconstructed it not to actually reconstruct it, because everything affects everything else. Right, is everyone still alive? Yeah, and just going to check my timings. Yeah, I'm all right, I think, at the moment. Okay, right. So here's the landscape that I promised you at the beginning. Take a bit of a look. Unfortunately, I haven't got the translation, but hopefully the visual aspects, the future is visual, the visual aspects will speak for themselves. So if you want to move towards creating Education 3.0, you need to innovate. So you do need to do things. You actually need to do things. And I would challenge each of you, again, to create a project out of today, to do something differently, and to become an educational innovator and create the future. So what I'm going to do now is give you 4 ways of doing that. All right, and I'm going to ask you which one you prefer at the end, and that means which one you're going to try. So the way I explain this, like, if you had a window on the future, you were looking out of your window, no windows in this room, so if there was one up there now, and we were looking into the future, this is what it might look like. So see this as your window, okay? And I've put a few labels on it, so I'm just going to point some of them out to you. So you can see that over the top there, there's a non-geologically possible landscape of mountains. Down here, we've got the city growing up with its industry, factories and commerce. And here we are over here with our higher education buildings. And up there is kind of the world of outreach and where we look outwards. And I've given them kind of learning type labels. So don't worry, I'm going to go through each one of the 4 quadrants. If your window was looking like that, then you could possibly look through the different parts of it in that sense. Okay, so I'm going to start with each one of those, tell you a bit more about what I think is in there and how you could possibly take that part of the landscape and innovate for yourselves. So, more or less, education 1.0 is there, 2.0 is there, 3 is there, and 4 is there. I'm just going to give you one nod to those people who like diagrams. Okay, would anybody not like a visual metaphor and like a diagram instead? Yeah. So what's down the bottom there is the well-established pedagogies that we're all familiar with, and also your university-owned technologies, your virtual learning environment, the other things we use. Up here is your responses to challenges and opportunities that are new ones that come your way. Down here are your established programs where you're using new technological opportunities for learning, and up the top there is future potential. So that's really what I'm representing. I only show this one diagram, so if you really like diagrams, not pictures, take a photo now. All right, if I carry on, yeah. And for the senior managers and executives who are here, if you want to innovate against these areas, the ones on the left-hand side do need you to tackle organisational transformation. And throughout my career, about the last 15 years where I've been in that kind of position, I've tackled these challenges by looking at organisational transformation. However, for everyone, it doesn't have to be that. You can also do small-scale research and prototyping and get feedback from the context, which will then form a way of moving across to the larger scale transformation that's required. So, okay, carry on everyone. That's 1, that's 2, that's 3, that's 4. So I'm going to talk about those. So, do you remember down the bottom, number 1? So what we've got here are kind of fairly traditional university-type buildings. This was actually drawn from where I was at the University of Western Australia in Perth. It is one of the most gorgeous campuses in the world, and I worked there for 3 years. It was absolutely lovely. So if anyone ever invites you, go there, definitely, and allow yourself a bit of time to look around. And it was based on Stanford, and people used to sort of open their eyes and think that's where they were. You know, it looked pretty much like that with the cloisters. And it's going back to really, you know, when universities were religious, faith-based organisations. It looks so much like that. But right slap bang in the middle of it, I've put a data cube. I mean, some people call them data lakes. So now, as you increase your volume and look to your quality of your teaching and learning, one way of innovating is to use data in completely new ways. We can now support students, for example, and there's a project I did at the university that this is modelled on, by giving them feedback on a daily basis based on learning analytics. So, for example, you can dramatically increase your student experience, which is the mantra, by doing that. And also, I've mentioned it before, but I think it's so important, I'm going to mention it again. Mobile is the new blend. It's not campus plus what they do somewhere off campus. It's an integrated approach. And if you want to do outreach, half of the world now has a smartphone. There are more mobiles and mobile connections than there are fixed computers in the world. And 2/3 of the world now has a mobile, and half of the world's web traffic comes from mobile. So we can't afford in education to ignore these massive, massive trends. The way I kind of think about it, if you imagine you're standing on a beach and looking out to sea, and you can see the waves coming towards you, and you could perhaps put labels on them. This will probably be my next video, won't it? And some of them reach your feet, don't they? And some of them don't. And really, it's very difficult to work out which one isn't going to. And you might see a massive wave that actually just dissipates by the time it gets to the beach. And then all of a sudden, something comes out from nowhere. And no doubt it has been caused by a big ship going by or some other climatic event, and you have to run back up the beach because it's going to swamp you and knock you over. So what you're looking for when you're trying to work with the way massive trends are going are those kind of waves. And in Australia, the Aboriginals call them the seventh wave. It's the phenomenon of the seventh wave. And surfers all know about the seventh wave. It's not actually the seventh one because they're random. But if you're walking along a beach, have a look now and see if you can see a seventh wave and see if you can give it a label. So I'm giving it the label of mobility. It's going to be massive impact in the future. And many of the very best organisations now have mobile first policies and mobile first strategies. So has yours? Have we got a mobile first strategy? Not yet, is the answer. But if you think about it, you actually then do your organisational transformation really a bit differently. Your choice of your careful investments in technology is different. The policies you create for the use of students' technologies on campus is different. And then, of course, you can really go into all the ways in which you can make this possible to change the student learning experience. So wearable devices, using the Internet of Things, you know, the motion and location, and you know, all these things become possible as part of your normal way of learning, you know, rather than as something extra. All of these slides will be for you, so you can look up all these links later. And these are the projects that I've got going at the moment. Sure, does mobility support better learning, lifestyles, convenience? That's all worthwhile. I don't think it's the most important thing, but it is worthwhile. It brings tools and resources that students didn't have before, many of them free. It creates the authenticity of learning so that you can be in the place that you're learning. So I'll tell you one that I've done on this recently. At Liverpool, they have a very good Masters in Business Administration, an MBA. But Liverpool being Liverpool, it also has a football tradition and it has a horse racing tradition. So we also had specialist MBA, so you could do an MBA in football or you could do an MBA in horse racing. Personally, I like going to the horse races more than I like going to the football. So I decided to use the new Blackboard Ultra, which is a cloud-based VLE. And we redesigned the foundation course for the MBA in horse racing, for the executives in the horse racing industry. That's what it's for. And we designed all the activities. We did it with a 5-stage model, but it was all mobile. And the byline was your MBA in the pocket of your jodhpurs. So if you're actually there. And then they went to the Cheltenham Festival for 1 week. And we did a whole range of activities that they did during that week. So it was like a placement for them. But instead, we used what was in their pockets for that. So it's an idea. Right, number 2 is up the top. So this was, the whole idea of this one is using your higher education institution, the one that you have here in this nice place, as your brand and as your vehicle to reach the world. So the byline here is exporting learning rather than importing students. And once you think about it in that way, you'll realise it completely changes the way you think about your learning provision and moves you in great leaps towards Education 3.0. So I'll show you an example. This is the new company you heard. I've just changed my job and I'm working with a new company called in London. But this is the parent company in Australia. I was Pro-Vice Chancellor at Swinburne University, which is in Melbourne. And we had 10,000 students working through undergraduate degrees entirely online across Australia. And, you know, there's absolutely no way we could get them all together. I just used this picture of, you know, yoga, I think, is one of the things it's fairly hard to do on your own. You need quite a lot of instruction and somebody moving you about. But you know, there's almost everything else, and they only came to campus for their graduation. The rest of it is entirely possible to do remotely. So that's the key message there. Of course you need good learning design. Of course you need stable and supportive technology. But the big message is it can be done that way, and it is being done with very large numbers. So if you want to have a look at it, it's a thriving academic community that doesn't actually meet, so that's where it is. So number 3, I'm going to speed up a bit because I'll run out of time, won't I? Do you remember down the bottom where the factories were? Yeah? The idea of this one is that no education institution is ever, ever, ever going to be able to create the kinds of technologies that we now use in our everyday lives. We would never be able to make that investment. So the days have gone where we can create little homegrown things that we think will work for us. Whereas out there in the world, there are amazing consumer technologies that are going on, but most of them are not being developed specifically for learning purposes. They generally have very good usability, because otherwise they won't sell at volume and make money, but nobody's actually thought, well, what do we need for learning? So it's our responsibility to invent that pedagogy, to adapt and transfer and move them into our world. So that's quite a different thing from using your VLE or your outreach of your curriculum, those kinds of things. It's another way of looking at it. And it is possible for everyone to do something in that field, something that you use in your everyday life or you know your students do. So I think one example is virtual reality. Costs a lot of money to put it together, but the headsets are now very, very cheap. And it's great fun. I'm sure most people here have tried a virtual reality headset now. Has everyone had a go? Yeah, it's such fun to try it. And of course, particularly in the medical, the science areas, the social and cultural areas. The one I'm using at the moment is a walk through an African village. And my colleagues think it's hilarious because I go around saying, oh, look, there's a chicken. Oh, Gilly. And, you know, so I think it's such fun to do. So, you know, look at that and then think about, is there one thing that you could do, you know, in your teaching? And it may be a bit of a novelty to start with, but it's cheap and easy to do, and it transforms the way the students will engage. And the other area, I think, is robotics. This is a human robot, humanoid robot. She's mine. Her name is Ruby. And I learnt for the first time ever in my career to program using Ruby. And I tell you, if I can do it, you can do it, your students can do it. And what you do is, it's almost like a recipe. You just pull in what you want on your desktop. You'll see the virtual robot moving. Then you go into the lab the next morning, plug it in, and it will move about. It was so engaging. In the end, we had Ruby doing tours for us. So this is quite different from the massive robots that you might get in a mine or for the construction industry and those sorts of things, which are also very interesting. But if you want to engage students, Jazz, my granddaughter, likes Ruby. So if you want to engage them right from early days and impact on their understanding that every job in the future will have robotics in it. Every job in the future will need to have a light approach to programming. There'll be no one who won't be able to do this. It'll be like reading and writing. And this is a great way to start. So I invite you to have a look. This is called the NAO robot, N-A-O. Maybe we could buy one for the institution. What do you think, Mr. President? And the whole thing on data science I've mentioned before. So have a look at this, and AI. I'm sure you've heard about the University of Texas that has a large number of online students. And the students rate their e-moderators every year based on how well they did. And one year they put an AI moderator in, and they called her Jill. So it was Jill Watson, and she won the prize. The students didn't know, but she won the prize for the best e-moderator that year. That's because she was fast and effective and responsive. So she was the Alexa, if you like, of the e-moderating world. So you'll see some of about it in that link there. Is everyone still alive? Okay. Do you want one more? Or have you had enough? Okay. Well, this is obviously where the dragons are. I can't tell you what's in there. This is over to you. But I can tell you that there are riches beyond belief in that. And why not here in Graz? Why not one or more of you actually delving in these deep waters and creating your own silk routes? So, you know, this is where things like the MOOCs were invented in these areas. So I'm not suggesting you do more MOOCs necessarily, but what I'm saying is there are things out there. What am I doing? I'm thinking about the University obviously for Education 3.0 and the lifelong learning areas, the curriculum of the future, and rolling that back into something meaningful. So that's where I'm at. But you need to find something that you're at in that area. So number 4 is probably about future work skills. This is a really good report. If you'd like to have a look at it, I've put the link on there. The future for wearables interests me quite a lot. I quite like fashion, and I've just got my first responsive T-shirt that changes colour as I walk along the street. Unfortunately, I didn't bring it with me. But there's some really interesting fabrics now where, you know, the interactivity is built into them. So sports science and so on. So maybe something in that area. And of course, you know, some people say the singularity is not only near, that it's just over in those mountains. And the idea of transhumanism, I think I've put a link in the references right at the end of this talk, that we can enhance the human brain and the human body and become a kind of a hybrid. I know it's scary, but if you think about it and think about the importance of cognition and enhancement for education, then I think you will think about something in that area. The importance of video and images, I think you've heard throughout my talk, to move away from the obsession of text. But also voice is very, very important. And, you know, if you haven't got a voice-enabled Alexa or one of something like that, get one now and try it out for yourself. They're really cheap, really easy to set up. And I do, unfortunately, walk into my kitchen, make my coffee and say, Alexa, what's the weather like in Graz today? That's how I knew what clothes to bring with me. She told me accurately. Yeah, so, but just try out some of the voice-enabled, because it is the future for learning. And it really is important. And then I'm sort of thinking wilder things. I mean, we're all hearing about blockchain, aren't we, in, you know, finance. But what about blockchain for education? Leave you to think about that one. I put a reference there so you can read about the social impact of blockchain. So that's my landscape. Okay. Now I want you to think for a few minutes where your one action, or your first action, if you like, I'm not only giving you one, you can have hundreds if you want, is going to be. And then we're going to raise hands, one for each quadrant, and get a rough idea of how many. All right, so do you want to think about it for a bit? Ready? I'll perhaps put the windows in. So this is number 1. Do you remember campus-based enhancement? Who's got an idea for that one? Anyone got an idea for that one? Can you stand up, please? Anyone else? Is she on her own? Anyone else willing to help her with her idea? Yeah, I'll help you. Okay, thank you. Number 2's up the top. Outreach, exporting learning. Who's got an idea for that one? And stand up, hooray, hooray. I'm going to picture that one. Oh, more. Very good. Whoa, what about number 3 down the bottom, the adaptability from consumer technologies? Oh yeah, quite a lot. I like it. Okay, thank you. Number 4, over the horizon. Hooray! That's more than I've had in about the last 6 talks about this. Well done. Well done. Okay, thank you. So I'm leaving you with this, the Education 1.0 to 3.0, and I'm leaving you with the landscape. So I hope this will be an important e-learning day for you, and you'll remember where you first got that light bulb idea. I just wanted to say, on request, a little bit more about design, teaching as a design activity. When I had dinner with some colleagues last night, they were very interested in this, and I said, well, it wasn't really what I was going to talk about. But there is a lot on my website about it. So it's called Carpe Diem, pluck the day, seize the day. And there's two types of it. One is actually designing programs, and it's called Seize the Day because if you get the right people there, you can do it all in one day. And this is what it looks like. And at the top there, you'll see the kind of storyboards that people create. So they actually create a whole pedagogical journey. And it's a very well-established, well-rehearsed methodology. And for your courses, there's a handbook on the website, so somebody can give it a try. And it's very collaborative, especially between the academics, the teachers, the learning technologists, the employers, the librarians. You all get together, and it's quite a structured and very intense approach, but it works. That's, you know, the key parts of it, and it does use the things that you're familiar with, the 5-stage model and activities. So it's just gillysalmon.com, and it's all open to use. So hopefully some of you might give that a go. So here's my questions for you. Can we understand the future as a complex adaptive system that we can design? You know, I think I'd be really interested to know whether you see it like that. How do we actually disrupt ourselves, given we're all here because of the traditional educational system? And that's why we're all here. It's served us well. So it's really difficult to disrupt ourselves to think differently. And how can we then go ahead and shape our preferred and viable futures for our students and for the whole of the country, really? So thank you for listening. I'm just going to tell you before I ask you to answer those questions that I put all the references at the back there, and I'll leave these with you. And the one I've highlighted is an article that's been published fairly recently that explores the landscape in a lot more detail. So there's quite a bit there for you. So, anyone want to challenge, first of all, expressions of horror, disbelief? What have I missed? And can you then answer some of my questions? I think we've probably got about 10 minutes, is that right? Yeah, is that right, Hannah? Thank you. And we've got some, one over there. Somebody, I think there's a mic going around. Is it that one? Thank you. So one over there. Okay, come in. Okay. Because they're recording, it's better to wait for the mic.
Considering being myself an early bird in Education 3.0, I find it very difficult to find suitable job offers. I mean, and I think it's the lack of a suitable label. I mean, how would you call an Education 3.0 professional? And I think as soon as there is a job prescription or a title such as optometrist or dentist, it would be probably much easier to match those who seek and those who need a profession.
I think
what do you think?
Such a good point. I mean, I'm using the term learning leader now. Learning leader, the idea of leading from the emerging future. And so I think that's where I'm at. It's probably not a job title. And I think the term innovation sort of went out of fashion a little bit, but I'm quite happy to bring it back. But I've always made sure my professorial titles have been kind of education futures, learning futures. So I think if you could become a professor, you can usually choose your own title then. Okay.
That would probably take a couple of decades. Yes. Thanks, sir.
Stay in touch. Okay.
Thank you.
Anyone else? There's one here. Thank you. Here we go.
I was just wondering, the question, how do we disrupt our own thinking? What happens if we disrupt our own thinking such that we revamp our whole method of teaching, and then the students come with the traditional attitude? How do you persuade students, especially as a non-Austrian living in Austria? I can tell you Austrians fear change.
Yeah.
How do you get them?
No, that can't be true.
And so how do you get them to see the value added?
Right, yeah.
When they say, well, why aren't you just sitting up there and standing up there and telling me what
tell me how to do it, Yeah, no, I absolutely understand. And where I've had the opportunity to be responsible for a whole institution transformation, I've done massive engagement of students. And so it's a longer story, but I'm happy to tell you more. But it's through the design approach. So they need to understand, just as we do, the importance of a different approach, both in the curriculum and in the mode of learning. And you need to then engage them in small-scale things, nothing that threatens their ability to pass the course. But they need to understand that they are the educators, they are the scientists, they are the workers of the future, and they have a huge responsibility. And I find a lot of students, I mean, they're very ethical students, aren't they, these days? Much more than we were, I'm sure. Well, we only cared about passing the exam, but they're quite ethical and will often respond to a different vision of the future. I've tried to get the student voice into all the work I do in the design, and it wasn't easy, I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I used to run workshops trying to get students to tell me how they wanted to learn in the future, which was a spectacular failure. I mean, they used to say, "You're the professor, why don't you tell us?" And so I've actually changed quite a lot and developed quite a lot of futuring techniques, but they'll often respond to the complexity of artifacts and what's the meaning of artifacts. So there are some techniques that do help them both to understand and engage with you. So it is really important to keep the student voice in there. That's a good question, thanks.
Thank you for your talk. I went to the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester, the home of the first computer, not Liverpool. And I'm going to give you two quotes. The production of too many useful things results in too many useful people. Necessity is blind until it becomes conscious. Freedom is the consciousness of necessity. Yeah. I think our mantra should be giving people a perspective so that they don't become useless, and giving people a necessity to expand the consciousness of society.
Right.
So that's where I see our kind of mission here, because we're going to have so much free time in the future, robots manufacturing things, and therefore we're going to have a different consciousness of what it means to be free, what it means to be democratic, what it means to be educated.
I think he's answered the question there, don't you? How can we understand the future? I think he's answered all of those. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else want to have a go? There's one here.
First of all, thank you for the great talk, and it's a bit problematic to ask small questions after that talk. I fully subscribe to everything you said about mobile. One problem I have, and I would like to know whether you see any, let's say, solution for that. If you are relying on mobile technology today, you are dependent on two companies, Apple and Google. They are more or less in control of your data. It's nearly impossible to use anything else. And don't you think that can also be a risk for education? And do you know of any initiatives to, let's say, to make something outside of that landscape?
To answer the the second one first, no, I don't. But I can't believe other people are not considering it. And yes, there are actually masses of risks in all of this, but to me the benefits outweigh them. And it's by doing things that we find solutions and solve the problems. So, yeah, you know, there will be considerable problems, but we can't let that actually stop us advancing the future for education. But there is an issue of control and ethics. But I think the world is moving towards understanding that better, do you not think? At least understanding it, which, you know, hopefully these solutions will emerge. What would you do?
Support initiatives like... I would support initiatives like, let's say, Firefox, Mozilla, etc. Yeah. But in the moment, there is nothing really realistic.
No, I don't think.
But I think universities should support free, let's say, free software and free hardware in this realm.
Yeah. I think as universities become much more commercial entities in their own right, it's become more and more difficult for them to adopt that societal role. It's very interesting because my husband was talking about, you know, all these reports about the new Cold War and, you know, how it's all happening in cyberspace and so on. And it is pretty scary and pretty difficult to understand because he's a data expert. But I asked him, well, what should we do? And he didn't have any solutions either. But yeah, I mean, I think we take account of it. But for me, I think doing things and solving problems as you go rather than stopping them would be more appropriate. Anyone else? We've probably got one last one. Right at the back there.
Thank you for your talk. Yesterday we already talked about this Carpe Diem model.
Yes.
Would you be so kind to elaborate on it, and especially the relation to this left side of the landscape where it's about the organizational transformation? Can you just talk a little bit more about this?
Right. I'm doing a workshop this afternoon where I can put a bit more in about it if anyone wants to do it. There's also, as I say, there's a handbook on how to do it. But just to tell you the origins of it, it was originally a small research project in Glasgow in the year 2000. And I was asked to create something that was a team building exercise. So it started off of helping all the multi-professionals around learning design to work together. But since then, it's been crowdsourced throughout the world. And the core of it is that using creativity techniques and rapid project development. So you go from creating the end of what you want, the outcome of the student of the future, and then you move through some very practical techniques. The main one you saw there was storyboarding, where you bring together all the different components of the course and lay them out, and then imagine yourself as a student of walking through it and how much time you'll spend on each one, how you're exploiting the university-owned or other technologies. It's been very popular, mainly because it only takes a day. And it is actually resulting in a lot more people using better pedagogy, such as the 5-stage model and activities and other approaches. So it's a small project that's turned into something huge, and I think it only turns into something huge if people find it practical and useful. So I'm happy to tell you a bit more. Okay, I'm handing back to Helmut now.